Hi, this is Jason Richter again, and I'm going to talk to you today about supply chain management as well as capacity management in terms of queues and waiting. So the objectives is to look at the trade-offs between ordering and holding costs in supply chain management and give you more or less a general overview of how you can better manage your supply chain, and then also discuss waiting and what it means to have waiting in your organization from a customer perspective, and then what are some steps you can do to reduce that waiting. So let's start with supply chain management. The goal of supply chain management is to take your overall, it's everything involved in your supply chain, I guess. There's a lot of different steps, a lot of different people, organizations that are involved in a supply chain. And so the goal is to ultimately use that chain to maximize your competitive advantage. So what are the importance of the supply chain? Well, you start basically from your raw materials and you end with your customer. And the supply chain is everything that is in between. So it includes your suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, and so on. And I'll show you an example of this in a little while. The supply chain is a considerable cost to your organization. And again, depending on what type of organization you are, will indicate or dictate what proportion of your costs are from your supply chain. So there is an added emphasis to managing these relationships. And here's what I was talking about, where you take your industry, you can look at what is the proportion of your sales that are reflected in your supply chain. And the petroleum industry is one of the largest. You can look in the healthcare industry, which is what we're focused on here, and hospitals have up to 40% of their sales that are involved in the supply chain. So here's a supply chain example for beer. I just wanted to show, here's an example so you can see how many different components are really involved. So up in the upper left here you have the farm, and they supply the hops and the grains. Hops and the grains go to the brewer. But then you also have these other suppliers that end up giving parts or product to the can manufacturer for this brewery, Budweiser. And then that in turn goes to the brewer. And down here you also have bottles, because Budweiser uses cans and bottles. So you have suppliers that ultimately impact the bottles. Maybe it's the labeler, maybe it's the bottle itself. And so ultimately you get to this point. And so for Budweiser to manufacture its beer, it needs all of these things: the hops and the grain, it needs the cans, and then it needs the bottles. So then what happens once it goes from Budweiser, or from the brewer, then it goes to the distributor, which then in turn takes it to the grocer. And then the grocer sells it to the consumer, and that's the end customer. Okay, so there's a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations that are involved in this supply chain for a brewer. So let's get back to when you're an organization, do you want to make or buy the aspect of the supply chain, whether it's a part, whether it's a employee, or do you want to outsource that? So the outsourcing, what it is you tend to send things out to outside vendors. Outsourcing does not necessarily mean that you send it overseas. It just means that you're sending it outside of your company. And there are some benefits to doing this, because these other suppliers are specialized in that area potentially. They could have greater efficiencies than you would as a company. It allows you as a company to focus on your core competencies. And again, not sink so much money into these other areas where you don't have the foremost expertise. So this is particularly true in technology companies where there's rapid changes in the environment. There's a lot of outsourcing that goes on in that field. So here's some common sourcing strategies. You could have many suppliers, just a few suppliers. You could be vertically integrated where you do everything yourself, or you could have a joint venture. We'll get into all of these. So many suppliers. This is commonly used for commodity products. And the reason is, if you have many suppliers, there really isn't much differentiation from one supplier to the next in terms of the product itself. It's a commodity. Purchasing is typically based on price. So you have lots of different suppliers that you can choose from, lots that you have chosen to diversify your supply base, and the purchasing or choosing of suppliers is typically based on price. So the supplier here is really responsible for all of the things that take that supply element to you. And again, the reason is there's many suppliers, so there's a lot of competition. Now here, the alternative to that is when there's a few suppliers. And in this case, the buyer would want to form some long-term partnership. You might want to ask why. Okay, well, the reason is there's very few suppliers out there potentially, or you're only using a few, so you're really, I wouldn't say indebted, but they have a lot of control or a lot of power over you when you're only using just a couple suppliers. If that supplier was to go out of business, think about what that would mean for your company. So you want to have, or tend to have, more long-term relationships with those suppliers. And then you tend to work with the supplier. So learning curve improvements, trading secrets, you're almost in a partnership when you have these just a few suppliers. Again, the cost of changing these suppliers is huge because you don't have that many. Maybe you only have one. If something happens to that one supplier, it's really going to affect you. And again, you've devoted or invested so much time into building up this supplier, building up the relationship, that a loss of that supplier, you'd have to spend a lot of time building up a new supplier. Now, vertical integration, this is where, again, where you do, an organization does it all. So they develop the ability to produce the goods or service that were previously purchased. So previously you went out in the supply chain, maybe you found a farmer to do your hops and grain as the brewer, Budweiser. Well, in this case, you would be the grower, or you'd own the company that grows the hops and grain. So no longer are you buying it from another supplier, but you're the one that is actually growing it. Similarly, you would have the distributor. You'd own the distributor. So you'd be involved in the distribution as well. Now this can improve the cost, quality, and inventory, but does require more finances because you obviously have more control, more business that you own. It's risky in industries with rapid change because, again, this is where all parts of your organization will also have to change. And the question again goes back to whether you'd have the expertise to make those changes. And if you did not, maybe you're better off not vertically integrating and using some other smaller company that maybe is very agile, very quick to change to technologies. For a healthcare example, you have hospitals that own physician practices. This is probably the most common example of vertical integration. So rather than have a contract with a physician practice, the hospital actually outright owns it. Kaiser is probably the most extreme example of vertical integration in that it owns the insurance company as well. So that they're the insurance, they're the provider of care, and they also own the facilities. So Kaiser out in California is a good example of vertical integration. And they've had great success with it. Joint ventures. So this is the final of the four most common scenarios. And so with a joint venture, it's not that one company owns another. In this example, it's just you're joint. You're shaking hands. You're making a deal from one company to the next. So you'd enhance your skills by working with these other company or with another company. You'd secure some supply or reduce overall costs with this kind of economy of scale or collaborative effort. You don't dilute your brand or give competitive advantage because, again, you're not buying out the other company. They're working with you. Supply chain risk. So now that we've talked about the four main types of supply chains, we talked about small suppliers, or large number of suppliers. We talked about vertical integration and joint ventures. Let's get into the risk overall of supply chains and what you'd want to consider when you decide which one of those scenarios you would want to fall under. So more reliance on your supply chain means more risk. So if you look at those four scenarios, you have a heavy reliance on supply chains when you only have a few suppliers. And so it increases that dependence on the supply chain and that individual company. Recently, there was an example with Apple where their screen maker went out of business. They were so reliant on Apple, and if Apple delays a launch of a product, that company is not going to have the capital. If it's already produced the screens, or if they've invested all their machinery and equipment into providing these screens for Apple. So again, it's heavy reliance on one company increases your risk. There's vendor reliability and quality risks if you only have a few suppliers. And then political and currency risks are out there for any type of supply chain. So what are tactics to mitigate risks? Well, you can research and assess possible risks. You do some sort of risk analysis before you'd get involved in business with any specific company and before you decide which of those methods you'd like to take. And that includes the reduction of potential disruptions. Prepare responses for negative events. So when you're doing this risk mitigation, you try to envision what could go wrong. What happens if we lose this supplier? Who is going to be an alternative supplier? Can they produce to the scale we need? Can they produce to the quality we need? Again, just some things to consider. And then having a diversified supplier base. So again, identifying who those other suppliers could be can help. Here's some tactics that some real companies have actually used. And I wanted to just go through based on the risk. So over here on the left, what if you have that risk, what tactic can you use, and what is an example of a real company that used that tactic. Okay, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on these. I just wanted to show them and make them aware or available to you. So again, these are all common risks, and then you'd have risk reduction tactics and a real example. Okay, so now we're going to shift a little bit and talk about a formula, and two formulas actually. We'll start with the inventory turnover formula. And I just wanted to show these because I consider them to be some of the most important, some of the most critical formulas in terms of managing your supplies. These are often what investors will look at when they analyze your company. So inventory turnover, and often seen in manufacturing companies, this type of analysis, but you take your cost of goods sold and divide it by your inventory investment. And down here on the bottom we have the what is considered to be the inventory investment formula that would go right in there. Here's an example from the Pepsi annual report. So you can see here's your inventory right here. So we have that adds up to this 1.69 as your inventory investment. So that is on your books, your annual report. And then your cost of goods sold also on your books and your annual report, 14.2. So what this is saying is that we're turning over how quickly are you turning over your inventory? So meaning, given that you sold this amount of inventory over the course of the year, how much do you hold now at the end? Okay, so we're holding just this 1.69 that we calculated from up there, and so we're turning at 8.4. Higher is generally better, but you're going to come to a point where too high means that this denominator might be too low. So this 1.69 might be too low, meaning we're carrying too low of an inventory. And so if we have a surge in volume, surge in sales, that we're not going to be able to meet those sales. So again, higher is generally better, but you do want to be careful you have enough inventory. Here I want to talk now about the EOQ model, or EOQ formula. This is the economic order quantity, optimal number of pieces that you'd want to order on an order. So again, this is a little different from inventory turnover, but still deals with supply chain. So the key here is with this formula, and the formula is right down here, is that you're balancing out your annual setup costs with your annual holding costs. So that's what you're trying to do with this formula. Balance your setup costs with your holding costs. And you can say, well, what is a setup cost? Well, it's really whatever it costs you to to place an order. It could be shipping and handling. Maybe it's the staff time, whatever the salary is for that individual to place an order. You look at holding costs, it's a little bit different. That's typically involved with warehousing the product. So this H right here, holding, typically a warehouse cost. You have this huge warehouse, you're paying to keep your inventory. That's what you're looking at with that component. So capacity management. So now we're going to shift away from the supply chain. Again, a very important part of operations, and move into capacity or queuing, the waiting component. So why do we care? Well, we care for a couple of reasons. Inefficiency. Are we utilizing our assets properly? And then secondly, what about the customer? Do they want to wait? Well, no, of course they don't want to wait. So how can we reduce their wait so that they remain our customer? So again, very important concepts that any operations manager would want to pay attention to. Here's just an example of the iPhone 6 release. You can see the queue outside the Manhattan store. I mean, look at this wait. Pretty incredible wait to get in for the iPhone 6 at the Apple Store. So I'm not saying they mismanage their queue, but our customer is going to be happy waiting in that type of line. Well, maybe if they get their product. So when we talk about capacity, we want to talk about the maximum number of units a facility can hold or produce in a certain amount of time. Some considerations you'd have for capacity: it's forecasting demand accurately. I mean, if you can't forecast your demand, well then how do you know if you have enough capacity, or how do you build the capacity to handle the demand? So again, knowing your demand really impacts the capacity you have available. You'd want to use technology, find the optimum operating size, and then build it for change. So you'd want to make sure whatever it is, whatever process, equipment, whatever you're doing, has the ability to change if your demand changes. Here's just a medical provider example. And let's start here at the top. So we have this actual production last week of 80 patients. Okay, so this is what a medical provider actually saw. Provider operates 5 days per week over a course of a 9-hour day, but then they lose an hour for lunch. So really they're operating for 8 hours. The design capacity, so the average for this provider is that they see is 2.5 patients per hour. Okay, over on the average over the course of the year. Well, the capacity per week is just 5 days times 8 hours a day times 2.5 per hour, 2.5 patients per hour. So you'd expect that 100 patients could be seen by this provider per week. That's kind of the capacity. But on this given week, we said we saw 80. Okay, so this actual was 80. The capacity was 100. This provider only saw 80% of the capacity. So you could argue, is this utilization good or bad? Well, a lot of you may say 80% is really bad. We should be at 100%. Well, 100% can be considered very, very bad. And the reason is, if there is any variability in this process, then what's going to happen is if you're at 100%, you're going to end up with a large queue. Because let's say the first patient comes in the door. We said we can see 2.5 patients per hour. But the first patient comes in and takes 45 minutes. What is going to happen for every subsequent patient that comes in? Well, unless we see those patients at a greater rate, meaning we see more patients per hour than this, we're going to have a buildup of patients. And it's going to get worse and worse throughout the day, because we're going to be behind schedule repeatedly. So everybody is going to have to wait. So you could argue, again, that that's a very bad thing. So you'd probably want your capacity to be in the 85 to 90% range, where you have the ability to handle variability in the process without generating large queues. So here in handling capacity management, you have a demand management, and you have ultimately capacity management. Demand you can manage through appointments, reservations, a first come, first serve rule. You can also do walk-ins, meaning that if appointments were short in duration, you could offset that with a walk-in. Capacity management, on the other hand, looks more at the supply side. You have full-time, or do you have temporary workers? Can you use overtime? Do you have part-time staff that you can call upon? So again, using temporary workers, part-time, kind of looking at those things. Waiting lines or queues. Queues are not limited to people. You can have a queue of medical records. You probably have a queue of things that you're working on for your job. You've put things in a queue based on their importance, perhaps based on deadlines. So again, it's not limited to people, but we're going to talk mostly about people in terms of the waiting lines. Queues are very common when resources are limited, demand is uncertain, meaning there's that variability in your demand. Now here's some common types of questions that involve queuing analysis. So how many receptionists should we have? What percent of customers will wait and will wait greater than an hour? Will wait maybe greater than 30 minutes? How many admitting staff do we need? So again, things to consider when you're trying to build out and limit the queues. So here I'm going to show a couple examples of different types of queuing systems. You can have this top one here where you have a customer arrive, customer goes into a queue. Here this is one person, here's another person ahead of them and another person. Ultimately, this person here at the service facility will say next. That one will come up and be served and then departs. And then what happens is you take this person here, that one just slides right up and gets seen. It's a single server, meaning you only have one person serving. You see this often in grocery store lines. There will be lots of different lines, sure, but really it's just a single server because you have this one person and you have a buildup of people behind that. So here's another example. McDonald's dual window drive-through. Have people arrive in the same manner, but now they're going to be seen by someone. So maybe now they collect the money at this phase 1. And then this person, after they have paid their money, they go on to phase 2, which is receiving the order. Okay, so it's using multiple people, so multiple service facilities to handle the queue. So here's a third one. Banks often employ this. What you'll have is a queue. I've seen this done at Wendy's even has this. So you have multiple people in line, and then what happens is they shift. So here, as soon as they go to whichever one's open first. So if channel 1 is open, then the person who's waiting right here will go to channel 1. If it's channel 3 that instead is the first one open, then that person goes down here. So you have this single line rather than a line behind each one of these service facilities. Instead of that, you have one line and then it breaks off into these different areas. So again, this is much more effective than the single line. And here's another a little bit more complicated example that's used often in college registrations. So here, again, you have a line, one line, and then somebody goes through and is served here in channel 1. When that's finished, then they have multiple options. They can either go here to this phase 2 facility, servicing facility, or they could go down here to this phase 2 servicing facility. So again, you start at the beginning. They could go to either one of these areas. They're both going to provide the same service. And then once that is finished, then they can go again to either one of these here, phase 2 services. So using multiple people that do the same thing, and it's basically a first come, well, not first come, first serve, but whatever's open first. Multi-server, multi-phase system. Now to get into this figure, what this shows is that the mean number waiting grows exponentially as utilization approaches 100%. Now let's go back just to that example where I said you have a medical provider, and instead of taking, let's just say 20 minutes on a patient, they took 45. Well, now the next person coming in is going to have to wait. And unless that provider makes up all that time on this new patient, you're going to have the following person is going to have to wait. And then the person after that. And so ultimately, more and more people have to wait just because you were late with, or it took longer with one individual. And that's because your utilization was so high, there was no buffer built in. We had no any delay to the system is going to result in a wait or a queue of people. Okay? So there's no chance to really save time on a new customer unless you cut their time. Okay, now getting into appointment scheduling schemes. There are different types of schemes you can use. You can use a block appointment, individual appointment, a mixed block individual, and some combination of those. And often in mental health, what they'll do is they'll have a block appointment and have multiple people go in for an appointment. Maybe it's 5 people that are seen at once. Purpose is to maximize the resource utilization and minimize the waiting. So again, one way of looking at it. And considering how you could set up some different appointment types, here on the left we have individual appointments. We have one scheduled for each 20-minute block. Okay? On the right uses the Bailey-Welch model. And what this does is it puts 2 people at the very front, and then there's only one person scheduled for each subsequent time until you get down here at the very end where there's nobody. What this does, the advantage to this approach, is that you have people at the very beginning that will have to wait. So I guess I should say that's the disadvantage. But if you see those people faster, take less time with them, then ultimately what you're going to have is no gap during the day. So there won't be a gap. You're going to consistently see people. You're always going to have someone being serviced. Again, the disadvantage is that you have people waiting. And unless you make up this time early in the day, you're going to have people waiting all the way throughout until you get to this time. So the only way you'd want to do this model is if either you thought you could cut some time and it wouldn't take you quite 20 minutes to see these patients, or if you felt there's going to be a no-show throughout the day. So if you have a high no-show rate, what's going to happen? Let's say both of these people show up. Okay, so somebody has to wait an extra 20 minutes. But then if this person does not show, now you're right on target. And then you can see these people right on time. And then you have this extra window here at the end of the day where you could either take a walk-in or maybe use it to get caught up on some other administrative work. So the advantage to this schedule that I see is it really accounts for the dilemma of no-shows. You don't have many no-shows, you probably don't want to use the Bailey-Welch model. Advanced access, I kind of look at this as open access. Traditionally, scheduling systems is the opposite of that. Traditional scheduling systems have long times until next appointment. They often have not high no-show rates because people are scheduling in advance. And as a result of the no-show rates, there's double or triple booking that occurs, which leads to the queues. Advanced access is patients are seen in the same day, reduces the no-show rate because they're just showing up and then they're seen, and it involves better continuity of care because you can have a team of providers that see this patient, and the team can be limited. If you have long lines or long waits for appointments, what often happens is people just go to the ER or go to the urgent care centers instead of to the primary care provider. So that's why I say better continuity of care. So again, it's not easy to manage open access, but it certainly is an option to consider, particularly if there's high no-show rates. Implementing it, here are just some general guidelines. You would want to be able to predict your demand. That's going to be the most important part of this, because you're staffing according to your demand. And that's how you get your capacity. Here's some metrics you could look at. Should you do open access or advanced access? And now let's kind of get into the end here, which is the psychology of waiting. And I include this because I want to emphasize this kind of critical article or from David Maister, which is that unoccupied time feels longer than occupied time. And many of you will realize that you do this in your organizations from the healthcare standpoint. If you have a patient that goes in, checks in, the patient then goes, is called out maybe a few minutes later to go to the exam room. The exam room, maybe 5 minutes later, a nurse or a tech comes in and takes the vitals. And then they say, well, the doctor will be in shortly. The doctor doesn't come in for, let's say, another 10 minutes. Well, what you've done is you've taken something where the waiting could have been a good 20 to 30 minutes up front, and now you've made the person feel like it's less, because there is that occupied time. Uncertain waits are longer than known waits. When you say, we will be with you shortly, shortly can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Shortly could mean 15 minutes to somebody. It could mean 5, could mean 1. If you can be more specific in your estimates, somebody will be with you in 10 minutes, within the next 10 minutes. The person then can visualize, okay, it will take me 10 minutes. If I need to go do something, I can do it. If I need to make a phone call, I can do that. When somebody says, I will be with you shortly, you just kind of sit there and you're waiting. It's a big unknown. So I would stress, if you can get people to avoid that connotation, or that, and I shouldn't say connotation, but that phrase, I will be with you soon, I will be with you shortly, and instead get more specific. Even if the estimates are conservative, you will be better off, research has shown this, you will be better off, you have happier customers. And when it comes to this, the importance of this right here, your HCAP scores for hospitals are tied to customer performance or customer satisfaction, and customer satisfaction is not often based on the level of care. It is based on the perceived or the customer service. Okay, so waits, somebody has to wait a long time, you're not going to get high marks. Again, very, very important. People expect the care to be good. It's when you go above and beyond in terms of managing their waits that your performance, perceived performance, goes up. And that's what matters for the HCAP scores. Again, another reason why this is important. You want customers to return. You want HCAP scores to be higher. There are bonuses or penalties based on HCAP scores that are financially related. Again, very, very important. I just wanted to show this right here. An excellent example of posting wait times. That's right here with Methodist. Here we have, at their different facilities, different wait times, right? This is to be seen in their ED. The advantage, or what I like about this, I should say, is this box right here. It explains exactly what this means, what 6 minutes, what 4 minutes, what 6 minutes means. Sometimes that is not the case. So we'll go back in here and look at Florida Hospital. Here's Florida Hospital. Same thing. Here they have the wait times. But what does this wait time mean? Granted, they're a lot worse than than Methodist, but that's beside the point. It's how do we calculate emergency wait times? So here, this doesn't tell you much. However, you could click here. So again, it's not as obvious as Methodist. Again, it's nice that they post the wait times. A lot of places do not even do that. And then you'd click right there and identify how do they calculate the wait times.